Welcome back. This is our second video in a series on revising in stages. And now we're going to do the Ruthless rainbow. This is a technique that I've developed to replace my old technique, which was to print out my papers and cut them apart with scissors and then like mix everything up in a bag, which I think worked really well too. And then I would just like rearrange it like a little puzzle, really like pick out things that didn't fit. But I do most of my work online like most people do now, and so this has been my alternative. Basically, you take your list of main points and you assign a color to each point, and then you go through the paper, and whenever something is hitting that point, you highlight it in that color. It's really straightforward, and it's just a way of visualizing the information that you're including. And if you're a more tactile person, I by all means suggest printing it out. You could do this with like real live highlighters if you have a set of highlighters, or you could do it with the scissors and just skip the color part altogether and just like cut it apart and treat it like a puzzle. I'm gonna skip the intro and conclusion for now. What we're going to be looking for here is if a sentence is addressing two or more points, we're going to evaluate its clarity and location. And then if there's a lot of unhighlighted sentences at the end, like when I'm done, I'm going to see what they have in common, if there's a major theme that I've missed, something like that. What I will normally do is take the key at this point and I will stick it at the beginning of the essay just so I don't have to keep scrolling up and down. And then I'm going to just take my first idea, the owner was cheap, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to highlight every time it turns out that the owner is cheap. Okay, so I've gone through and I've applied all the colors throughout. I will point out that the writer's introduction isn't really it's not an introduction because there's a bunch of extraneous information in it. So stuff that you don't necessarily need to get started on this. And I would just go ahead right away and move these two sentences that are talking about her co-workers down to another part of the paper. I don't yet know where they're going to go, but they shouldn't be in the introduction because you don't necessarily need to know all these little details about the co-workers to appreciate like the introduction of the story. So we're going to move this someplace else for now. This paragraph I just moved, it could go in any number of places early on in the paper. And this is kind of how to think about this. This is background information that you need to know before understanding the next two paragraphs because they are stories about the coworkers. And actually, a lot of what's not highlighted here is stories about the coworkers. So I've included a category for the narrator's coworkers added to the story, and this is almost just purely descriptive so that I can keep track of like where we're talking about the coworkers and if all those ideas are more or less together. So once I've got most of the body paragraphs highlighted, it can give me like a bird's eye view of when things come up and what is going to come up. So here's a sentence that's not highlighted at all. And this is for some reason, after I'd been there less than a month, they made me the shift manager. And we might ask ourselves, okay, so what is this sentence actually doing? Well, what the sentence is, as far as I can tell, is it's intending to indicate that there should have been signs, right? That she should have known better. And actually, she mentions that earlier on. My dad says I have a trustworthy face, but I think it should have been a warning sign for me. That sentence was originally here. So I think when I moved all this stuff down, I moved this sentence too, but it should have gone back up. So I'm just gonna move it back up. Easy peasy. Now that makes more sense than it did before. So now we have our next sentence that doesn't have a highlight, and it says, when I closed the store that night, I looked in the safe to count the money and it was all gone. So this sentence seems to be, it's a narrative element, right? It's letting us know that this bad thing happened. We can't really tie it to any of the other observations we've made so far about the narrator being a good listener, because I don't know what the narrator was doing while this guy was like sneaking in. I guess she was in the freezer probably, which I think should be an alternate title, like Dairy Queen drama, subtitle, My Summer in the Freezer. I think that would be very clever. That just, it sort of will just occur to you as you are going through your paper sometimes that you need to improve the title. But always bear in mind that your title should be descriptive not of the assignment that you're doing, but of the content of your paper. And it's part of your attention getting device. It's part of your introduction. You're trying to entice the reader to become curious. And I feel like Dairy Queen Drama is already a pretty cute title. And then the subtitle is kind of cute too, and it does prove to be true. So what I'm tempted to do at this point is to take this main point that I have here and to actually refine it and say something like, and this isn't at all unusual to have to do this kind of checking, but like the narrator learned a lot about herself and others from the responsibility of her summer job. Well, that's a ready-made sentence whenever I'm ready to start sticking things into the introduction or as topic sentences, which is coming up. This is one that actually really explains a lot of the orange. I think if I go through and I'm looking for things that are doesn't think it was fair, like that's something you learn about yourself. That kind of works. I can, it's not always going to be perfect with shoehorning in, but this is a great paragraph because of the whole like describing something, and the coworker's part of the story, and then returning to like the thing that the writer learned, and then also back to the main point, which as we see is actually starting to emerge as being a common theme at the end of every paragraph. The narrator's complaining about how cheap the owner is because the security cameras are disconnected. It just keeps coming up, right? So that actually, this purple here and purple here, or pink, I guess, lets us know that they are returning to the same idea. Oh, there it is again. We have a theme. This is really, encouraging. Another thing we see here is this in white. I asked her if she thought it was creepy. And actually, I hadn't thought about it at first, but this definitely classifies as the narrators being a good listener. Because I think maybe a lot of managers, maybe they wouldn't think to be like, what do you think about this thing you just reported to me? So it maybe does indicate that the narrator is a good listener, though that could be clearer, obviously. So another tactic, we've talked about moving stuff around. We've talked about changing the types of main ideas that we're looking for to make it more specific so that it fits better with the bits of information that are still left over. And another thing you can do is rephrase sentences to make them fit, right? And that's actually kind of the goal of writing, is to force your ideas to fit into some kind of coherent format so that people can follow them more easily. So I've revised this sentence to refer more clearly to the idea of the responsibility that the narrator was faced with, because of mentioning like the duties was to close the store, and then also that they were surprised. So now together I have this basically falls into the narrator learned a lot about herself and others from the responsibility of her summer job, right? So it does work with that because there's a reaction about, her own reaction and then to the situation based on her responsibilities. I see that coming together very nicely. Because it's a memoir has memories tied into it. This little one that I haven't got in white yet, or it's in white still, it's not been highlighted. I really feel like this could be tied into the idea again of the narrator learning about herself, because so I've rephrased this to include the narrator really learning something about herself as a result of this experience. And then now it's in orange again. And little stuff that gets left out, like another night and from and when. Don't worry about that. You can edit that out if you don't like it, but it's mostly these big ideas in white that you want to make sure you're taking stock of and thinking about it. My instinct here tells me that this probably just falls into the category of the business was in a dangerous location. And we can't delete those because they're really important story elements, but we kind of have to figure out what they're serving, like what purpose they're serving. And in my opinion, I think that these sentences are serving the whole, like, this is a dangerous location made worse by the cheapness. So then we have this thing about her interactions with her dad, where he's making her quit on the spot. And it's followed by a really quick transition to and I forgot all about it. And that's an interesting kind of place, right? Because there's this idea at the beginning of anticipation, because if we get down here, eventually we find out that her dad, after the robbery, right, after the coworker calls her, her dad tells her, I knew this was going to happen. Well, and her dad has a great amount of foresight, right, because he's making her quit on the spot. And this actually falls into a problem of chronological storytelling that I think a lot of writers fall into, where they want to report every single detail, or they want to report details that in retrospect stood out to them as being significant, but you have to impose purpose in order on stuff. So this If you're writing a research paper or argument, you may be tempted to include extraneous information. But what I would do here is consider some kind of clever way to make this all fit into the either I'm a good listener category or the I learned a lot from this experience category. So I've added in this event marked the end of my summer job because I called and told my dad what had happened. And so I'm going to be able to mark out the summer was over bit because it's redundant. And then I'm going to turn this into it was time for me to start my junior year of high school. And so instead of like I kind of forgot about the drama of Diary Queen, I'm going to edit that. So I've imposed something upon this now, which is that I wouldn't have had another thought about the drama at the Dairy Queen if I hadn't gained a reputation for being a pretty good listener while I was working there. So this is going to be all in green here at the bottom, this whole thing, because that's now definitely in the narrator's a good listener thing. We're going to put this in orange because this is something where the narrator is displaying self-knowledge of like, I wouldn't have thought about this again. The I was actually relieved, I think, can go in orange because it is a reaction. I don't know yet what to do with the dad, making her quit on the spot. But when I have this green here, this is a claim, right? If I hadn't gained a reputation for being a pretty good listener. So I need to go back up here and make sure that I have enough green to emphasize that. And I really don't. There's only one line of green up earlier in the story, so I haven't yet justified that. So chronologically, I haven't proven it. And even if you were writing an argumentative essay, if you are relying, this is almost the end of the paper, if you're saying, and I have thereby proven, whatever, and then you go back and you look earlier on, you're like, oh, wait, I'd never talked about it until just like a little bit the paragraph before, that's a really good indication that you need to bring it up throughout or sooner. Or just have a really big paragraph right before, because sometimes arguments are built that way. So I've taken creative license here, and I've added in to that paragraph a couple of sentences. One is that we got to know each other, we swapped stories. Okay, that's definitely a green. I'm justifying the later claim by adding this in, right? Gained this reputation, got to prove this reputation. Even though initially Annie, the manager, was kind of cold, she opened up and learned that she was tending, that her boyfriend was a jerk, and she was eating too much ice cream. That just seems like something someone complain about. And also, she learned a lot from her responsibilities, right? So we're getting to this thesis. And quietly informed her that the owner's cheapness, so I got back to the security cameras again. So this is the kind of work where, you see how like each paragraph has like a primary color. In this case, it's the green is like the main one of this one now that I've edited it. And also gets back to the central theme of the owner's cheapness is causing this situation and the narrator is learning a lot from this experience. Basically, that's kind of what you want to go for. So like in this paragraph, we have an idea of like the coworkers added a lot to it. And here we are again with the narrator reflecting upon the responsibility. And then again, we return to the cheapness caused the problem. And then we have more of a commentary on like this whole thing comes together. This is the culminating point, right? This is the climax of the story. So it kind of makes sense for almost everything to be represented here. We've got the dangerous location. We've got the good listening narrator. We've got the cheapness of the, causing the situation, and then the cheapness finishes us off. So you can see what's happening by the color coding, and that's the point I'm trying to get across. So you've already been doing this part of the walkthrough where we're reviewing what is there. We're seeing that most of the body paragraphs are more or less the same color because they're focused on the same point. If there are sentences or parts of sentences that don't match, ask yourself why it's in there. And what it's doing for the paper, how is it directing the reader through the paper, and then reorganizing the sentences with that in mind. That was almost a natural and organic thing to do once we started looking at each of these and noticing like, oh, that doesn't go there, oh, that doesn't go there, and moving them around. But I think I've made that point. Hopefully you can see kind of how in depth you have to get to help somebody with their organization or even to do your own organization. And this is kind of helpful also if you're more of an intuitive, like by the seat of your pants kind of writer, where you're just sort of writing stuff out. This person was basically writing almost a stream of consciousness essay that they then edited a little bit. So it does take significant rewriting. The next step is you want to review the order of your paragraphs, and you have to actually make decisions about this. And I think I've been demonstrating that too by explaining why I would have moved some of this stuff up earlier on and moving things around. This thing where I decided to move the introduction to the coworkers down here. But then that, remember we complained, or I complained at the beginning. I said, oh, that paragraph's too short, but we'll just set it aside for now and we'll decide, and then when we added to it, now it's actually a really important paragraph in the paper, and that can happen sometimes. So it's really important to kind of trust this process, for lack of a better explanation of like why it works. It helps you to see like what is going on at a glance, and I think that makes it easier for a lot of people to reorder their work. So these are some considerations. Is there information that the reader needs to know before they can understand a point? Because, if you're making a big claim and that claim relies on people having background information, the background information has to come before that claim. Otherwise, the reader has to have that information in their head assembled as like an understanding before they move into what you want them to do with that information. So when you're writing an argument paper, it can be helpful to consider if any of the points are more impactful to the thesis or others, and how you want to communicate with your reader. You use your very best point first. Well, what's the rest of the paper going to be about, right? So kind of think about that, think it through. And there's lots of resources that you can find about organizing your paragraphs. I have some listed on Canvas. Portions of the paper need to be shared chronologically. So this is if you're explaining a historical event, if you're explaining a process. In the case of the essay we've been looking at, this section where first there's the guy from McDonald's that kind of robs, like low key robs the place, definitely needs to come before the point where there's like somebody threatening them with a gun practically, and that definitely needs to come before the part where the main manager calls the narrator and lets her know about this event that it took place. So like this definitely needs to come in chronological order, but you just have to think about like if there's a series of events that take place and then there's a repercussion as a result of events, definitely they need to be chronologically shared. And you also want to think about how hostile or friendly your audience is. If they have a lot of resistance, it might be better to kind of break down their resistance before you make any suggestions, just as an example. But that wraps up stage one. Stage one for me is I don't know, it's not my favorite thing, but I find that the rainbow part makes it a little bit easier for me because I'm a visual person. And hopefully this is helpful for you. We will reconvene with stage two. And I hope that you're able to stick with me for the rest of this, because I think it will definitely help improve your reading and your revisions.